And then I'm going to share screen. Okay, good morning. All right. Last week we discussed the mitzvah of gerushin and the mitzvah to give a get as Martin described it. Today we're going to start getting into the main section of the beginning of Gittin. The main section of the beginning of Gittin begins with the first Mishnah, so we're going to start with the first Mishnah and take a look at that, and then we're going to take a step back and look at some of the material surrounding that. So forgive me for not having translated this into English. I just didn't have a chance. But the first Mishnah in Gittin starts off, I just have it here, starts right here in front of you. Just make it a little bigger for you. The first Mishnah in Gittin starts off, maybe get Medina Tayam, if one brings a get from overseas, you have to say it was signed in front of me and it was written in front of me. This is, as we pointed out already, a mitzvah b'derabbanan. It's somewhat a surprising beginning for a masechet. We would have expected the Mishnah to start off with the last Mishnah in the last parak, which is what are the reasons that one can get divorced. Instead, it starts off with a derabbanan, someone who brings a get from overseas and needs to validate the get in some way or another. This presupposes that the get needs to be validated, even if it's on the derabbanan level, that the get needs to be validated. That's number one. And number two, that it can be validated by a witness, one witness, which is interesting. And the third thing is that it assumes that a get itself, once it's validated, this is the part that we're going to talk about today, is sufficient evidence that someone got divorced. Right, again, I'm going through those three assumptions again. Right, that a get needs to be validated. Two, that it can be validated by one witness. And three, that once validated, it's sufficient evidence that someone is divorced. Let's just continue the Mishnah for a moment, but it's that last part. Is a get really sufficient evidence that someone's divorced is a question that I want to kind of probe today. So Rabbi Gamliel then goes on and says that we don't know where those places are right now, but those are places in on the periphery of Eretz Yisrael. And they also would have to say this b'fanei nechtav. Rabbi Eliezer has the smallest geographical scope. He says, I feel mikfar ludim lelud, which I assume, right, the environs of the village of Ludim to Lud, that would also require someone to say b'fanei nechtav. V'chachamim omrim einot tzarich she'amar b'fanei nechtav. The aide doesn't question the necessity to say these words or their efficacy. Instead, he simply says that the geography he disagrees with. Only if you bring it from overseas, Medina Tayam would be, let's say, islands, I assume they mean Cyprus and Greece and those places, or Hamolich, or if you bring it get from here to there. He says, in addition, if you bring from Greece to Turkey, you also have to say it's Rabbi Shimon Gamliel says, afilu mihagmonia lahagmonia, which for now we can just translate as some sort of region to region. Then the Mishnah goes into a discussion, which is not going to be our discussion at all today, although the Gemara will discuss it, and maybe we'll deal with it. I don't think so this year. But then the Gemara deals with using this Mishnah as a reference point for the geography of Eretz Yisrael. What is included in Eretz Yisrael? It's assuming that within Eretz Yisrael you don't have to say b'fanei nechtav, or even if you have to say it, if you come from overseas, we have to define where is Eretz Yisrael. So Rabbi Yehuda Omer mirekem lemizrach, from this place Rekem, and eastward for Rekem k'mizrach. Rekem is already considered east. Me Ashkelon ledarom, Ashkelon to the south, and Ashkelon kedarom. I figured that would be an appropriate thing to read today. Ashkelon is part of the south. Mi'ako letzafon, v'ako ketzafon. Akko and Tzafon is already not considered part of Eretz Yisrael. And remember, Akko keretz Yisrael legitin. We'll have to understand that line a little more. We will see about. Then the Gemara says, as a final, the Mishnah, says, I maybe get Eretz Yisrael a no tzarich shemar fanei nechtam. One need not say b'fanei nechtam. One need not this additional piece of evidence if you're bringing it in Eretz Yisrael. Should someone come along and question the validity of the get, then yitkayem b'chotamav. You simply have to validate the signatures. So the question of what the purpose of Fananechtam we'll get to in just a few minutes. But in order to do that, I want to kind of take the broader scope. And this is the way Rav Lichtenstein started also when he taught this parak and the next parak as well. He kind of took a much broader view of this whole thing. And he said, why is a get evidence at all of anything? Well, it's when you come and say you're divorced, when you produce a get, and let's assume you say b'fananechtam, or let's say in the last line of the Mishnah, you are able to validate the signatures in some way, right? Through let's say a rabbinical court. Why is that evidence of anything? After all, don't we know the laws of basic evidence? And the laws of basic evidence, as described in the Torah, are al pi shnayim edim. This is the first source in front of you. I'm just going to make it a little bigger for those watching at home, which is everybody today. Lo yakum ed echad beish lechol avon ulechol chatat b'chol chet asher yechetav. Right? Let not one person testify when it comes to any violation, if you will. Al pi shnei edim or al pi shlosha edim yakum davar. Things can only be validated with 2 or 3 witnesses. So, on what basis can any star, forget about a get, but a get in particular, on what basis can that function? And if you want to know how far this goes, so this is a basic machloket rishonim, but it's worth thinking about just for a moment as we begin Masechet Gittin. Rashi al Torah, which is cited, by the way, by Tosfot. It's one of those rare cases where Tosfot knew about Rashi al Torah. It's their grandfather, but they call it Rashi al Torah, right? Unless it was an addition later. I didn't check in the manuscripts to see if this line, which is very rare, really appears in the original version of Tosfot. But Rashi al Torah, at least it appears to us, says, Al pi shnayim edim, velo sheyichdevu edutam beigeret v'yishlechu lebeit din. There is a chisaron, there's a lacuna. If someone writes their edut and sends it, what we call, everybody knows what we call this? An affidavit, right? There's no such thing as an affidavit according to Rashi. So for all the lawyers in the room who've taken affidavits in the past, no, that doesn't have any halachic validity according to Rashi, al Torah. And this is a strong position in the Rishonim. I'm going to show you some examples of it. Again, I'm reading it again in Rashi. Velo sheyichdevu edutam beigeret v'yishlechu lebeit din. Velo sheyamod turgaman ben ha'edim u'ben ha'dayanim. You can't even have someone in between, an interlocutor between the edim and the dayanim. So, for those of you who thought, okay, I know I can't take an affidavit now, but at least I can still be a lawyer. No, testimony isn't acceptable unless it's delivered directly according to Rashi al Torah. This is something maybe you remember from reading Parshat Shoftim, but it stands in quite dramatic context to an entire Masechet that we want to understand and probe called Masechet Gittin, which seems to indicate that, again, like we said, if you bring a get, then we have full evidence that the woman is divorced. Maybe we have a din d'Rabbanan and you have to say b'fananechtam, but not in Eretz Yisrael where just yitkayem b'chotamav is enough. I don't understand. Rashi just said it. Lo yichshavu eidotam beigeret v'yishlechu lebeit hadin. Right. This is particularly accentuated by the Yerushalmi in Masechet Yevamot. I'm skipping the Bavli for a second. I'll come back to that in a moment. The Yerushalmi in Yevamot says as follows: Matz'o katuv b'shtar meit ploni neherag ploni. Right. If let's say someone finds a document, again, all too close to our reality today and our painful reality today, but trying to for a moment just go abstract for a moment. Should one find a document that says so and so is dead, or so and so was killed, Rabbi Yirmiyah Amar Mesinat Ishto, we can marry off his wife. In other words, his wife is entitled to get married again. Right? This is the antithesis of what I just said. In other words, a star, right? And again, we have to talk about, and we will talk about. We'll talk about a little later today already. What qualifies as a star? Is that like a little petek that says I saw so and so dead, or does it have to have 2 witnesses, or do we have to qualify? Do we have to validate the star? But whatever it is, Rabbi Yirmiyah says if you find the star that someone says that's the equivalent of edut. But that's not the part that I'm interested in now. What I'm interested in more is Rabbi Bon. Rabbi Bon Bar Kahana. I think that's Rav Avin. Right? That's just Yerushalmi language in Palestinian Aramaic. So Avin becomes Bon. Right? Rabbi Bon Bar Kahana Amar. This is the part that's important for me today. Ein mesin et ishto. The fact that you have written evidence, and let's say we meet the threshold of what a star is. Let's say for our layman's perspective right now, it has two witnesses, and the witnesses were validated, and we know that it was good, etc. And let's say I'll even give you it was given in Beit Din. Too bad, it doesn't make a difference. We can't marry a woman. In other words, that's always the basic indicator, right? If we find someone's dead, can his wife remarry, right? Because there already we're dealing with chashashot deoraita of mamzerut, and here Rabbi Bon says no. Written testimony. This seems to go right in line with Rashi. Written testimony is insufficient for us, right? And not only that, but we have a Tannaitic source that seems to support this. It says the Yerushalmi matnita Messiah Ladain, matnita Messiah Ladain. We have a Tannaitic source that supports Rabbi Bon's approach, and we have a Tannaitic source that supports Rabbi Yirmiyah's approach. Again, for right now, my purpose is to bolster up Rabbi Yirmiyah and convince you of the Shita of Rashi, that there's such a Shita exists not only in the Rishonim, but even in the Gemara. Says the Gemara, matnita Messiah Rabbi Yirmiyah, al pi edim. You, right, the Torah says, evidence, the rules of evidence demand edim. Lo al pi ktavan, not if they write it. V'lo al pi miturgeman. V'lo ed mi pi ed. We'll come back to each of these things in a few minutes. But you can't write your testimony. You can't have it an interlocutor. Again, a miturgeman is someone who translates it, but it's just an interlocutor, I assume. And not even ed mi pi ed. Right? In other words, if one tells somebody else, that's not enough in writing. Then the Gemara says, "V'achshav ein mesin ed mi pi ed, v'tikavate al pi ktavan v'al pi miturgeman mesin." So there's a split in terms of halacha l'maaseh, whether we do ed mi pi ed or we do ktavan or mesin. But the bottom line is there is a Tannaitic source that says that written testimony is completely invalid, no affidavits anymore. Right? This particularly is crystallized in a famous passage in Masachet Gittin that we won't get to this year, but I do want you to see it. This is the text right before you, right? The top text on the page. Tanya im lo yagid. Right, this is if you know testimony. That's the pasuk in Vayikra. If you know testimony and you don't deliver, then you're a sinner basically. If you have evidence that you could provide, right? That's if you could talk it out, right? So the Gemara says im lo yagid. If you don't testify, prat li ilaim sheino yachol lahagid. Meaning that's coming to tell you not just only an issue of whether you violate a sin if you know a testimony, you don't bring it, and you don't offer the testimony to the court, but it also comes to exclude an elaim, someone who's not able to talk. Meaning the rules of evidence are not relevant to someone who's not able to talk, right? Mute. Amai, says the Gemara. Here you have it explicitly. Hare yachol, aha yachol dahagid mitoch haktav. Can't the mute simply write down his testimony? Wouldn't that be sufficient? Marle Abaye, edut ka amarta. You're talking about edut? Shani edut. De Rachmana amar mipihem. Velo mipi ktavam. Now again, it never says the word mipihem in the Torah, just to be very clear. It doesn't say that word. What it does say is al pi shnayim edim, or al pi shlosha edim yakum davar, and therefore they say that requires a peh. And the Elaim, someone who's a mute, doesn't have a peh, doesn't have a mouth to be able to speak, to articulate his thoughts, and therefore he's excluded. Okay? Now, all these sources seem to indicate, now again, if you took this source seriously, and as far as you want, if you read the Bavli and Gittin in light of Rashi al Torah, again, that's silly to do, but in light of the Yerushalmi, you'd come up with a conclusion that an Elaim is pasul not only as an Elaim, it's really the Ktav that's problematic. Right? You understand what I'm saying? There was the Bavli takes it, seems to pigeonhole it to the case of the Elaim. Rashi al Torah and the Yerushalmi seem to indicate it's not just the Elaim, it's a much broader theme than that. It's no writing is ever acceptable, no affidavit from anybody. So it turns out that question whether the Elaim is a psul in the guf, or it's an Elaim can't do it because he's outside of the category of evidence, or is in a much broader category that no one can ever write anything, that seems to be a machloket rishonim. Tosfot, on that Gemara, takes a much more moderate position than Rashi al Torah. This is where he quotes Rashi al Torah, and the Yerushalmi. Tosfot says the Bavli doesn't have this broad position that all ktav is usher. Right? If until now I was presenting that there's no affidavit ever allowed, no one's ever allowed to write anything, writing is not allowed, that's objectionable to the Torah, which sees only direct evidence, and we'll talk about why in a moment. Tosfot says, wait, hold your horses. We gotta moderate this a little. Right? Tosfot in Masachet Yevamot, Amak Amar Bat Elaim says, V'ad Tanya Misha also, Amar in Gittin, V'im lo yagid prat li Elaim she'no yachol ledaber, And then the Gemara says, then the Gemara says, Shani edut Rachman amar piyam v'lo mipiktavim. Right? Says Tosfot, that doesn't mean that don't take that Gemara like in the light of Yerushalmi, and in the light of what I read you in Rashi al Torah. Don't read it like that. Says Tosfot, no. That's only a din of the Elaim himself. Shani Elaim, she'ein ra'ui la'agid. This is not, the Gemara in Gittin, unlike the Yerushalmi, right, is not interested in excluding all written testimony. It's only interested in creating a psul aguf for the Elaim. The Elaim has a chisaron. He's not in the parsha, right? Kedarmin, and he quotes a very interesting analogy that's not for now, but he quotes the Gemara in Menachot, Kol she'ein roi lebila. The continuation is ein bila ma'akevet bo, right? Bila is mixing the korban, right? You have a wheat korban that's mixed with oil and water, right? So the question is, what happens if you forgot to mix it? Is it still a valid korban? So the Gemara says, Kol haroi lebila, anything bila means to mix. Anything that can be mixed, even if it isn't mixed, it's okay. What's the analogy here? Says, right, that's what we use that in all sorts of examples. Like, for example, we don't tell a woman when she goes to the mikveh to open up her mouth. We need mikveh waters to get to every place. So we say, since it could be, even if it isn't, it's okay, right? We don't make it, that's one of their explanations of why it doesn't have to get to inside her mouth the water. Because kol haroi lebila, ein bila ma'akevet bo, if you didn't do it. So there's many examples here, but what's the analogy here? The analogy here is someone who could speak, says Tosfot. This is Tosfot's position, unlike Rashi, al Torah. Anybody who could speak, if they write, we accept it because they could have spoken. But an Elaim who's not in the parsha, he's not able to speak, so we don't accept his writing either. Or in other words, Tosfot basically completely neutralizes or takes an opposite approach to that of the Yerushalmi and of Rashi al Torah. Affidavits are fine as long as they're from anybody but an Elaim. The Bavli's approach, according to Tosfot, is that the Elaim case is case specific, and it might even be a psul aguf in the Elaim, right? Continues Tosfot. Aval acher, the key line here. Mo'il ktav yado. Mo'il ktav yado. Now, if Tosfot had stopped here, I would have been very, very happy. Anybody else can write an affidavit, right? But then Tosfot adds a little word that you should just keep in the back of your mind. Kish zocher ha'idut. Right? When he remembers the edut. In other words, if you remember something, then you can write it down after the fact instead of just telling it over. Right? What if I don't remember all the details, but I made myself notes? Would that be okay? In other words, I saw a murder. Forgive me, I saw a murder, and I wrote down notes afterwards. I don't remember exactly what happened, but I'm not on the stand because I'm writing now. Right? Apparently, if I'm on the stand and I say, let me consult my notes, that would be okay. But what if I write an affidavit now, and in the affidavit I wrote, right? So Tosfot says you can write an affidavit, right? Please correct me, lawyers on the phone, if if the affidavit is not writing your edut. I'm pretty sure that's what a shtar is, right? It's an affidavit. I know it's done in front of a lawyer, but it's still, signed by me, etc., or signed by witnesses who saw me. So Tosfot says you can write an affidavit, but you have to remember what it is. You wouldn't be able to use notes of recalling what you did. Right, so Tosfos doesn't take the most extreme position, which is that you can write any edut, and that edut is the same. Right? You see that? It's a little different, right? But I think for the most part, Tosfos is the best formulation of the antithesis of the Yerushalmi and Rashi. Right? So when we talk about a get, right, functioning as, again, at least in our initial gambit, we talk about a get, right? We come back to our Mishnah for a moment. When we talk about is get sufficient evidence that a woman is divorced. After all, it's a shtar, right? It's a contract, it's a document. So the answer is, if we're in Tosfos's camp, we're in a much safer space than if we're in Rashi's camp, right? If we're in Rashi's camp, we're going to have a much, much harder time explaining how a get works. And, right, we can basically go home right now and not learn Masachet Gittin to some extent, right? Tosfot, just to finish up, Tosfot quotes, that's why I said this line, I didn't check in the manuscripts of Tosfot to see if this line is actually in the original Tosfot. Right, because it's rare. I don't remember too often in all of the Tosfot and all of Shas, Tosfot citing Rashi's commentary on Chumash. Right? Umiu beperush Chumash, perush Rashi al pi shnayim edim prat shelo yishlachuk tavam lebeitin. Right? Tosfot. So someone has to check that. It's also weird because usually Tosfot talks about perush bekuntrus. He doesn't talk about Rashi on the Chumash. I would get, again, this is in our printed Tosfot. I didn't have a chance to check. It wouldn't surprise me if this line was added by someone later and wasn't originally in the Tosfot. It's not in the manuscript version. But either way, it does highlight that I'm not the first one or the second one. Rabbi points that out in his article about this. He points out that this is kind of two approaches, Rashi versus Tosfot. This issue, before we get back to Gittin, has a couple of nuances about it. One of the commentaries in Masechet Gittin, Rabbi Shai de Trani, right, who's a French rabbi, right, in the late medieval. So he says, so here the Rid takes kind of like a much more interesting and nuanced perspective on the thing. What if a guy comes into court and he's standing in front of the court and he says, I want to write my testimony. I don't want to read it to you. This might be more like the affidavits that we do today, because the affidavits, I think they're sworn, right? But they're not in front of a judge. It's to the best of my knowledge is based on what they do in my office and what I see on television, not what happens before. But imagine someone comes into court and the judge says, "Okay, we'd like to, interview." And he says, "No, I prefer to write it down." Right? So the Rid says you can't even do that. That's already right. Ela bipiv. In other words, he requires the articulation, oral articulation of the evidence. Why is this important to me? Because this line kind of raises a couple of possibilities of, even if we don't take Tosfos's radical position that the Elaim is a psul haguf, he's unique, but everybody else could write down their testimony. Here we have someone saying, no, you can't write down your testimony. You can't even write it down in court, right? But here we're already getting a sense of why. Why wouldn't you? According to the Rid, it's not an issue of taking an affidavit someplace else and sending in written testimony. In other words, that kind of testimony that we need. Let me raise it a priori, and then you'll see it in the text maybe a little better. One could view the reason for not accepting written testimony in one of two ways. You could either say we need an unmediated experience of the courts, right? We need the courts to be able to face the person directly, right? Or it's a din in the courts, so to speak. The way courts function, the way justice functions, is that the person has to show up, right? And therefore, sending a letter or sending an affidavit won't do the trick. That might be that might be a din in the courts, basically. That's one way to formulate it, right? Or the court system, this is a responsibility of the courts to hear evidence. Then one would be less apt to accept the Rid's position. Once I'm in court, so then it's unmediated. The fact that I choose to express myself via writing as opposed to via orally, why should that make a difference? I've shown up in the court. Whereas the court wants me to show up. Right? That's what I'm saying. If someone were to disagree with the Rid. On the other hand, one could say this has nothing to do with the courts. It has to do with the individual. We want to try to get to the best testimony we can, and the best testimony we can is if the person has. It's like the difference between email and talking on the phone. When you talk on the phone, you get a better sense of what's really going on. Sometimes when someone writes an email, and you can't really get a sense from the text of how they're feeling, their body language, their intonation, etc. So that's a requirement, not of the Beit Din to get testimony unmediated, but it's a responsibility of the individual to give testimony unmediated, because we want to make sure we have the highest level of evidence. If that's the case, then I'm much more sympathetic to the Rid's position, that even if I come into court, the issue is oral. The issue is the court wants to hear it, mipihem, right? That also manifests itself in a position of the Ritva. This will be the last part we do for introduction before we go to our Gemara now. Says the Ritva, it's not important what he's talking about. Right? It's when in a certain set of circumstances, it's not important. That's if you send your tano to the Beit Din. Aval, this is the part that's important to us. If you were to write down your arguments to the Beit Din, and then you say to the court, Shem tonim kamoshe katuv sham, ein bekach klum. right? That's not good enough. In other words, if you come into court and say, I am testifying what it says here, that's very similar to the Ritva. That doesn't count, to the Rid, that doesn't count. Right? That doesn't, in other words, that doesn't meet the threshold of it has to be from their mouths. Shafilu be'edim katav Rashi mipiyam v'lo mipik tavam. Shlo yishlochu edim edutam lebeitin bi'igera. They can't send their testimony. Mosh katuv b'Rishat Torah. Ha kol shenoten. Sorry, I didn't read that well, but this is the line that's important to me. Sorry. He says, Rashi says that even when it comes to edut, ha kol shenoten eduto ktuva lebeitin ve'omer ma shekatuv kan ani me'id mi. Right? If someone comes into court and says, what it says here is my testimony, unlike what the Rid says. Sorry, forget about the first part. I bumbled that the way I read it, so I apologize. But the point is, he comes to the conclusion. He says, if you write it down, whatever it says here, I'm testifying this is true, without saying what actually the testimony is. Or it's here the Ritva comes along and defends an affidavit. He says, when you bring an affidavit, all the judge has to ask you is, hey, do you stand behind what it says in the affidavit? And if you say yes, then the affidavit, the written affidavit is fine. Right? He said, but the Ritva then adds something that's very interesting. He says, that meets the threshold of mipihem. We heard something from your mouth. You understand? Where it's not like Rashi ala Torah that you can't send anything. Right? It's not like Tosfot you can send everything. Right? It's you can send something written as long as you testify that is your testimony. Right? That's kind of like a middle ground. So I was thinking about this, like, is this a din on the Beit Din? Is this a din on the individual? Is this the way to get us to the best testimony? Does this allow the Beit Din kind of a window into your veracity? I'm not sure exactly how to understand the Ritva. But the moment you come along and say, this is my testimony, then you can have it written. Well, if that's the case, right, then maybe we're open to the possibility that if we have some other way of demonstrating that a get is a get, that's the real thing, right, that's what really happened, then maybe we could do it, and maybe even, have someone else come along and say it. Right, maybe that's good enough. We'll come back to this in a few minutes, because one could have taken a much more radical position, and there is someone who does. Right? All of these Rishonim, all of them, right, share one thing in common. They take extremely seriously this principle of mipiyam v'lo mipik tavam. Right? They take this drasha of the Elaim who's out, and they say it has to be mipiyam mipik tavam, right? V'lo mipik tavam. What's the difference between all three approaches in the Rishonim? So Rashi has the most radical approach. He says mipiyam has the highest threshold. You cannot write anything. Tosfot says the Elaim, the mute, he's a psul haguf. Everybody else, when they write it, they're reaching the threshold of mipiyam. Do you understand what I'm saying? Right? Tosfot says kol haroi labila. Since you could have mixed it, it's like you mixed it. Right? Since you could have articulated it, you could have said it. So the fact that you wrote it, except if you're a mute, the fact that you wrote it also reaches the threshold of mipihem. You follow? And the Ritva comes along and says, you know what? Yeah, you can write it. I understand that Rashi says you can't write it, but you can write it if you come along and say, hey, this is my testimony. You come along in court and say it's my testimony. And again, we played with a little why. Is it the court? Is it the individual? Is it because we want to increase his veracity or not? But you understand, they're all taking mipiyam v'lo mipik tavam very, very seriously. They're just saying that we can reach that threshold in different ways. You can get there because it's sometimes when you write it, it's mipiyam v'lo mipik tavam. Do you understand what I'm saying? But it's even writing somehow meets the threshold of mipiyam. But one could have taken a totally radical other point of view. And of course, it's the Soloveitchik family that takes that point of view, which is, and again, it's not just the Soloveitchik family. You'll see why, Reb Chaim was the main articulist. But one could have said that when it comes to the writing of a shtar, when it comes to the writing of a document, we're not on the same maslul, on the same pathway as regular edut. maybe there's different criterion for a shtar that might require all sorts of different things. But mayim, it's not that we have to get to mipiyam v'lo mipik tavam, right? If you're going on the path of regular edut, that's one thing. But it could be that mipiyam v'lo mipik tavam has some other track towards getting to the truth. And that other track to getting towards the truth through the innovation called shtar won't require us to, how would I say it, do halachic gymnastics to get to the threshold of mipiyam mipik tavam. Right? Do you understand that from a conceptual perspective? Because then I want to try to walk you through that. So in order to get to that theory, so to speak, I want to get to Reish Lakish in our Gemara. So I'm gonna and then show you how it works. So I'm gonna read our Gemara now. If you have a Gemara, it's much easier than following online on my page here. But if you don't have a Gemara, it's okay as well. You'll just follow with me. But I'm gonna basically read a page of Gemara now. With my one goal today is to get to Reish Lakish's din. Right, Reish Lakish, as you know, is a Eretz Yisrael authority, in the 2nd century. And Reish Lakish is going to come along and say something very, very dramatic about the world of Gittin, which is basically, which is going to, how do I say this nicely? It's going to enable us, after having basically said there's no reason to even open Masachet Gittin because a shtar is of no value, it's going to give us the basis, the halachic basis for the whole get, what a get is. So in order to do that, I'm going to do something very problematic, which is I'm going to read Rabba and Rava without dealing with them. Okay, so the Gemara starts off as follows. Here I'm on where it starts the Gemara. Okay, my taima. Why do you need to say when you bring a get from Chutz Laaretz, let's say, why do you need to say b'fanai nechtav, b'fanai nechtav? Why does one aide have to come along and say it was signed in front of me and it was written in front of me and it was signed in front of me? So here we have two approaches. Now I'm already on Amud Bet of page 1. Number 1, and again, we're going to come back to this, I promise. I don't promise, but I hope we'll come back to this because this is like the most basic thing in all of Masachet Gittin, at least in the Rabbanans. One says, Lafi she'ein b'ki'in lishma. A get needs to be written, the pasuk says, v'katavla. It has to be written for this woman, this specific woman. This lishma is a little different than the lishma in korbanot that we're familiar with, that a korban has to be done for an ola, a chatat has to be done for a chatat, etc. This lishma is that it has to be written for this particular woman. But you can't write, if there's two people with two couples with the exact same name, you can't write, a form get for these two people. It has to be written for this particular woman, right? I have my brother-in-law now. His daughter is going out with someone whose father has the same name as him. Can you imagine? You think of the two, Yosef and Shimon was in the same city, and it's happening in my family right now. Anyway, so I shouldn't say that while we're being taped. Okay, anyway, so they're not. We don't know it was done lishma. So the only way to know that it was done for this particular woman is if the guy comes along and says, "Hey, I saw it written in front of me, and I saw it signed in front of me." That seemingly makes lishma. We'll have to see how. Rava, unlike Rabba, Rava says the fish ain't edim mitzuyim lekaima. Since if you come from Medina Tayam, from Greece to Israel or Cyprus to Israel, there aren't witnesses who can validate the signatures. And since there aren't witnesses who can validate the signatures, so we need somehow, in order to get to that threshold, there's a different threshold than I've been talking about, saying b'fanai nechtav will solve the problem. My benai, what's the difference between the lishma or ein mitzuyim lekaimo? Ika benayu that you betray. If two people come along and bring it, until now we've been talking about if one person comes along and brings the get, and says, what if two people come along and bring the get? So if you think that there aren't edim that can validate the get, now there are edim that can validate the get, and therefore apparently we don't need to say, we don't need to say if there are two people. But if the issue is lishma, what happened originally, then we'll still need to say inami. Alternatively, if you bring from one city into another city in Eretz Yisrael, so if the issue is lishma, so we know in Eretz Yisrael everybody knows lishma, but if there's no edim mitzuyim lekaimo, so here there are no edim, right? No, it's not in this city. There are no edim that can validate it. Okay, inami, or alternatively, botam medina b'medina tayam, right? In the same city, overseas. If you bring from Greece to Greece or whatever, Athens to Athens. So if the issue is lishma, that's still going to be an issue, and therefore you'd still have to say b'fanai nechtav there. If the issue is there aren't witnesses around, so there are witnesses around, and therefore you wouldn't need to say it. Okay. Now the Gemara goes through an excursus about Rabba and Rava. That's going to take us to Reish Lakish. Rabba, who says that the reason you say the reason the one witness has to testify that it was written in front of him is because there was no lishma, right? Libai trey, shouldn't this witness who's coming along and right, the guy walks in on his, imagine the guy walking in on his horse and he says, "Here's the get," and it was signed in front of me and written in front of me, or written in front of me and signed in front of me, I should say, right? To be more clear, why don't we require two witnesses like every other edut? Where it's mapitom that we here will require one witness, or one witness is sufficient. Didn't we say above in the first source al pi shnai medim? If we said before we said al pi, we said al pi, right? You need shnaim also. So the Gemara says eidechanem on b'isurin, right? It's almost like it's a heresy what I'm doing now that we're skipping all this stuff, but we'll come back to it, right? One witness is believed in certain cases, right? When it comes to Isra v'Heter, one witness is believed. That's why we can trust one witness for kashrut and one witness for mikvah and all that kind of stuff, right? So the Gemara says, when do we say one witness is ne'eman b'isurin? If we have a piece of meat in front of us and we don't know whether it's kosher meat or non-kosher meat, the loit chazak isur, because there's no chazaka, there's no, right? We don't assume, there's no presumption of isur. But this woman, we knew she was married. So the presumption was that she was forbidden to the entire world. Now you want to make her able to be married to everybody else? Right? That already involves things that relate to manners of, issues, rules of davar shebe'erva, of modesty or sexuality. We have a principle, whatever the source is right now, it's not important to me. Everybody knows that you need two witnesses for that. You need two witnesses, someone died, etc. So the Gemara says, oh, here we have a different thing. It's true, according to Rabbi, you need a witness because of lishma, but we have a rove that goes along with that, with what's going on. The rove beki in him, right? You see where I am? So we have a rove, a majority of people who do know how to write at lishma. It's only a miut that don't know how to write a lishma, and we can solve that miut by having one witness instead of zero witnesses, right? In other words, two witnesses, we're not going to require two witnesses. It's not a regular edut. It's not regular edut because it's eidechanem and b'isurin. It's davar shebe'erva. Yeah, but since there's a rove, the rove works together with the davar shebe'erva, the rove works together with the one witness to overcome the problem of the davar shebe'erva pacham mishnai. And for now, we'll be satisfied with that. Of course, this has thousands of implications and practical ones, etc. Says the Gemara, "Vafil Rabbi Meir, the chayish lemiyut." Even Rabbi Meir, who in general is concerned about a minority, and there are a few people who write Gittin who don't know what they're doing. There are. I can trust me because I know them. Right? Stam Sifri Dedaini Mikmar Gemiri. There are most standard scribes. Mikmar Gemiri means they know the laws. They know that it has to be written lishma. For Rabbanan who de itzrich, and the rabbis only require this statement of lishma. So the Gemara says, and here because we're afraid of the issue of aguna, meaning if only one guy shows up with a get, and we're not going to validate the get, then she'll be stuck forever possibly because the other guy's in Medina Hayam. So because of that, again, basically we're going back and forth, right? Don't we require two witnesses? No, it's a davar shebe'erva, we should require two. No, rov b'kiyin. Not everybody, even Rabbi Meir who says miut. No, because excuse me, mishum iguna, it's only the rabbanon, and mishum iguna gula rabbanon. So the Gemara says, "Hi kulahu." You're telling me this is a kula to rely on one witness? Chumra, it's a chumra. If you require two witnesses, lo ati balu maru pasile. If you require two witnesses to come along, then there's no chance the husband's going to come along. The husband's have second thoughts about coming along and saying, "Oh, I never wrote the get, or the get wasn't kosher, etc." But if you allow one witness, which again will free her, then you're basically incentivizing the husband who wants to mess her up or whatever to come along and be ma'arer, right? Ati balu maru pasile. The Gemara says, "Kevin damar mar b'fnei kama notnu Rabbi Yochanan Rabbi Chanina chanamar b'fnei bet chanamar b'fnei gimel mikar medaktaik v'lo ati l'ruei nafshin." since there's some other thing that's preventing the husband from coming in, this is all just, going down a very strange line, but they say since the husband had to give the get in front of 2 or 3 people, right, and he knows it's going to be given in front of 2 or 3 people, so up front, he's very, very careful about what he does because he's not going to mess himself up, knowing that 2 or 3 people are going to be there. He's not going to say, he said, I get in front of 2 or 3 people and I didn't do it lishma. That would be very problematic. So that itself contributes to the whole picture and allows one witness, according to Rabbi, to be trusted. Okay, if you didn't follow the line logic, it's okay. Let's keep going. Now the Gemara says, Ula Rava. What about the other way? The reason you have to say B'fanei is because there aren't witnesses there to validate the signature. So why don't you require 2 people there to validate the get now? They buy a tray. Midi the Haviaki start to Alma. No, shouldn't you require? In other words, if basically saying B'fanei nechtam is going to solve the problem of validating the get, so why don't we require 2 people to say it, not 1? Shouldn't it be just like validating the get? So the Gemara answers the same thing. Right? We trust 1 person in this area. When it's a piece of kosher meat, we don't know whether kosher or non-kosher meat, but there was no chazak, there was no presumption of prohibition. So it's chazik isur. So says the Gemara, and here we get to finally to our line. Bidinu the bekium shtarit nami loli boy. Really, says the Gemara, you don't need to validate a shtar. This is supremely important for us. This is the opening for all of Masachet Gittin. In principle, a shtar need not be validated. This is the antithesis of the Yerushalmi. The Yerushalmi says you can't write a document that you get. Written documents have no veracity in the courts. This line, which is, again, there is no one who talks about shtar that doesn't talk about this line. Bedinu de b'kiut shtari nar, you never need to validate a shtar. And again, in the most radical formulation of this, a shtar is a different track of evidence than, you remember what I said before? Before I said everybody, Tosfot, everybody says they're trying to reach that statement, right? Oh, yeah, the Elaim is excluded, really, right? Remember? Here you have, in principle, a shtar need not be validated. Kidder Reish Lakish. Tamar Reish Lakish, Eidim Achatumim ala shtar, when you have Eidim that signed on a shtar, Na'asu Kemi Shenechkera Edutan Bebeitin. It is like their edut was accepted in court. Not only was it accepted, it was nechkara. What does nechkara mean? It was investigated in court. V'rabbananu de'itzrich. The rabbis required this additional b'fanei nechtam. They didn't really need to do it. And therefore they were mekel and said only 1 person needs to do it. In other words, this isn't the track of what the witnesses come along and say, or witness comes along and says, he's not validating the shtar. He's just giving additional, potency to the shtar. But the shtar was already potent on itself, on a doraita level. Right? Then the Gemara says, that's a kula, it's a chumrah. And the Gemara says, no, it's really right. Isn't it a kula? Because the Baal B'mar, and the Gemara says, since he knows he has to give in front of 2 or 3, he's going to be very, very careful. Okay? This statement of what a shtar is kamish nechkara edutan bebeitin. Again, I want to make sure you understand what that means. That when one writes a shtar, when a shtar stands on its own, it's as if it was accepted in court, and it was as if it was invested in court. It has a number of nafkaminas. It has a number of approaches, a number of dimensions to this statement. Once we accept Reish Lakish, and I want to just read them to you very, 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 very quickly. The first one is, right? Okay, one, obvious. We don't assume that a shtar is mizuyaf, right? That's going to be a line that we're going to read later on. This is the 4 things that I'm reading here. Right? We don't assume that a shtar is invalid. Once we have a written shtar, we assume it's okay. We don't assume it's false. Shtar in general are considered to be valid documents. Right? You get a check, you assume it's a legitimate check, right? The very fact that you have to cancel, right? The bank can't. This is the best way I can explain this. I was thinking about how I can explain it to you. The fact that we, again, in our generation, right? Not today. In our generation, what happened? You wrote a check. Someone gets a check. Do they have to call the bank to validate it? No, they go and deposit it. The only way you can stop a check is by stopping a check. If the assumption was that a check isn't a valid document, and every time you got a check, you'd have to call the bank and validate it, They wouldn't just can't cash the check. You understand? That is, once you have Eidim Chatum al Shtar, it's Commission Nechkara Edutan Beitin, right? Right? Sorry, just one second. Hello? Okay. Right? That could be for one of two reasons. Rav Lichtenstein explores this a little in his article. He says it could be that just people don't generally, fake checks. They're not mezayef. Or it could be something much more radical, and this is what Reb Chaim is going to say, which is that when you have a shtar, the shtar says two things. It testifies on the content, and it testifies that it's true. It's the very fact that there's witnesses that sign on the shtar, forget about the check, because that's only one witness. But if you have a shtar that has two witnesses on it, the witnesses implicitly are saying what we said here is true. Not just that whatever we're saying happened. We're saying that the way we want this shtar to work is that it's a valid document. Okay? Very, very quickly. A couple of other things. This came up before, so I want to just talk about it. What about aid me p aid in Shtara? There's a Gemara in Masachet Makot. I'm going to do this in 2 minutes right now. There's a Mishnah. Okay, let me just make it bigger for you. Let's say two witnesses come to Ranana and they say, we saw so and so guilty of a murder, was judged to be guilty in the Tel Aviv court. Which they don't know what he did. They don't know he was a murderer. All they testify is that the court convicted him of murder, right? And Ploni played it off. Then the court in Ranana can give him the death penalty. You understand? They testify that he was convicted. They can kill him someplace else as long as they have aidim that he was convicted, even though they don't know what happened. That's called aid me p aid, right? The Shulchan Aruch paskins this thing. What if one testified in the Beitin Ranana, one testified in Tel Aviv? Yavo Beitin etzel Beitin v'yitzarfu edutan. Says the Rama, right? Then Ranana court has to go to the Jerusalem, to the Tel Aviv court and tell them what happened. Aga, aval acherim sheshamu einyan einan yocholin litzaref to have aid me p aid. But if someone else was not the rabbinical court itself, but they just happened to hear, they can't walk in, right? Dov, you can't walk. If let's say you were a witness to the court, right? You were sitting in the galley. You can't walk into the Tel Aviv court and say, "I heard X talk about Y" and say he was a murderer. You're not allowed to do that. That's aid me p aid. You understand? What would you say about aid me p aid when it comes to shtar? Right? Can I testify that I saw something in a shtar? So if you take the approach that we started with, the three opinions, but they're all trying to reach the same threshold, they're all saying the edut of a shtar is regular edut, and we're just trying to get to the same threshold of that, then you'd say, well, just like aid BPA doesn't work in regular edut, it can't work in a shtar. The K'tzot HaChoshen was one of the commentaries here. Again, I don't have time to read it right now, but he says it could be that when it comes to edut b'shtar, that aid BPA would work. You're allowed to testify about the fact that there was a shtar written. It says something like that, right? He says, just 1 second, I'm sorry. Hi, I'm still teaching. What's up? Yes. Actually, the minhag is not to do it if I'm whenever either way. Okay. Either way. Okay. So he says just in this last line here. Right. He says, just in the part, I don't know if you can see where I bolded now, but he says b'shtar shenisraf. Let's say you have a shtar shenisraf, o shenimchak ha'edim, o shenimchak, or a shtar that this is when the edim achirim me'idim alav mishum the shtar adif. He says the shtar might be different than regular edut, and you can have aid mipi aid. That's very, very fascinating. Again, without going into the details right now, you can look it on your own. But that suggests that there's a different track of shtar. The shtar isn't a regular edut, right? We already said, mipiam velo mipi ktavam, right? We already said it. How do you deal with mipiam velo mipi ktavam? Can you have, right? We know a get works to be a formal evidence. How can a get work if you mipiam mipi ktavam, right? So everybody else tried to say, oh, we reached the threshold. Then maybe there's a different approach that says, when you have a shtar, it's not mipiam mipi ktavam. You don't need mipiam velo mipi ktavam. It's a different track of evidence. One set of evidence is when witnesses come into court, and maybe then they have to be able to speak. Right, and maybe yes, maybe we trust them if they don't. But there's another thing called a shtar, right? A shtar that speaks differently. We'd have to talk about what makes up a shtar. I don't think Rashi would accept this approach, but this is it's a very, very compelling thing. And the person who makes this the most famous is Reb Chaim, Rabbi Soloveitchik's grandfather, right? He says, right, remember, what is the phrase? What's the phrase of Reish Lakish? Says Reb Chaim, again, I didn't bring the whole text for now, but he says, this is the last text we're going to do today. I'm sorry, I went a little over time. I'm also running late on my next thing. But he says, Edim who signed, it's like they were investigated in court, meaning Reish Lakish on Daf Gimel Amud Aleph and Gittin. Zehu kol ikar gzerat hakatuv d'shtarot. This is the whole, we'll talk about what the pasuk is, but this is the whole chiddush of shtarot. This is the most radical formulation you'll ever hear. This was like a big innovation. This became a big, big leitmotif of the Soloveitchik family. Okay, when it comes to all the masechtot that deal with with shtarot, kiddushay shtar, this, but it's particularly here. Delo shayach gabayu kol dinei kabbalat edut v'agadat edut. The entire pasuk of Deuteronomy 19 is not relevant to the world of shtar. You don't need accepting edut. You don't need telling edut. Hare ikar yisod kabbalat edut he dafka bifnei beitin. He says, I accept Rashi that if you want to do the edut track, you need a beitin. V'hacha b'shtarot lo beinin beitin klal. Can you imagine? As he says, the world of shtar operates in a different form of evidence taking. It doesn't require a beitin. And everybody knows that. You don't require, again, Drisha v'chakira is Masechet Sanhedrin, right? What questions do you ask them? You remember? Or Masechet Rosh Hashanah, right? You remember that? What side of the, right? You remember when it comes to Kiddush HaChodesh? Which part of the sky was it in? What color was it? How big was it? Etc. All those questions where we're trying to filter out what's true and what's not, none of them are relevant. Who says you have to shine a star during the day? A star is not the maslul, it's not the track of regular evidence. It's a different track altogether. You don't need daytime. Since the star doesn't require beitin, right? He says that everybody would agree with. This isn't edut. What happens in a star? This is a totally different track. So when we come back to our Gemara now, this line of Reish Lakish is a huge innovation in Reb Chaim's vision. It's not that we're trying always to reach and stretch to get, how do we get to, how does a get work? A get works because it's a different track of evidence. And when someone brings a get, we can trust it because it's a star, not because it's regular evidence. It's a different type of evidence. What that is and what constitutes a star, that we'll have to figure out next time. We'll start with that next time. What constitutes a star? Is it just like if I write a check, is that a star that operates in a different form of evidence? And that's why we can trust one signature, etc. Is there something else? And there's a famous Rambam on that. And then we'll go back into our Gemara and try to work backwards and try to fill in some of the details that we started. So again, what we did today was we started off talking about the requirement for saying b'fanei nechtam, b'fanei nechtam. I noted there were three issues when it comes to the Mishnah, but the biggest, besides the fact the Mishnah has two parts, one talking about the Gvulat of Eretz Yisrael, and one when you say b'fanei nechtam, b'fanei nechtam. But the big issue of b'fanei nechtam, b'fanei nechtam is that you have to say that it's good enough, and that but the most basic thing is that you require a statement like that. You require something. And the question is, once you say it, that would validate the shtar. But that raised the question, do you really need a shtar at all? How can a shtar even is a shtar even evidence at all? So what we saw is a lot of Rishonim groping to see how we can make a shtar meet the basic requirements of evidence acceptance. That was the first part of the Shiur. Rabbeinu Tam, an Elam, that's exception. Rashi, really a shtar doesn't work when it comes to that. It doesn't meet the threshold of Mivei Davam. Or the Ritva, if you come along and say, what it says in the shtar is what I want in front of the Beit Din, that would work. We talked about whether you need intermediate, unmediated or not unmediated. But then we pointed out that Reish Lakish's din throws a monkey wrench into the whole thing, because Reish Lakish's din sounds like there's a second track altogether. Din is shtara, which is a whole different din, and now we have to start thinking about what makes a shtar and what makes this evidence different. But Reb Chaim's formulation of Reish Lakish kind of brings a whole new paradigm to what evidence is. You can have evidence in writing that's different than evidence in, orally, and that's what I want to explore next week. Okay, I'm sorry again, it wasn't as interactive as I like. Mir Hashem, next week we'll hopefully be together, and then we can do that more. Thank you very much. Okay?
Thanks, Seth. Thanks, Rabbi.
Okay, be strong, everybody.
Okay, you too. Yeah.